Good afternoon. My name is Ray Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. I'm honored to be here on Algonquin Anishinaabe territory and pay respects to that nation and the people who've cared for this territory since time immemorial. We'll introduce our colleagues shortly, and along with the Housing Partnership Canada, CHRA commissioned a study from Deloitte Canada to analyze the impact of the supply of community housing and economic productivity. And we're linking these two difficult challenges that Canada is facing, a desperate shortage of community housing and lagging economic productivity. And the result is very clear and very strong. Increasing the supply of community housing leads to improvements in economic productivity. Le résultat est clair et solide. L'augmentation de l'offre de logements sociaux dans le parc immobilier complet se traduit par des gains substantiels en termes de productivité économique. If Canada's community housing share, as a share of overall housing stock, met the OECD average of 7%, we would boost economic productivity a staggering 5.7 to 9.3%. And that economic benefit, if we maintain that level of community housing, would be as much as $136 billion of improvement to GDP each year thereafter. And we estimate that those gains to the economy will outweigh the costs within 2 years of hitting that target. This is clear evidence that the solution to these two challenges is one and the same. We can make significant improvements to economic productivity and create greater affordability by increasing the stock of community housing. Now I want to introduce my colleague Kevin Albers, the Chair of Housing Partnership Canada and CEO of Macola Housing Society.
Thank you, Ray. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to really underline the key finding of the report, and that really is that there's that causal relationship between the supply of community housing and economic productivity. So if we increase the supply of community housing as a share of our overall housing stock in this country, we improve productivity, we increase productivity. If we decrease the supply of community housing by failing to invest in both nonprofit and co-op housing, we actually see drops in economic productivity in our country. And so let's be really clear. It's important to know that the economic gains and the stimulus actually provide from the construction of housing is actually increasing the productivity enhancing benefits by having this more community housing in our sector. There are really improvements in economic efficiency where there exists a greater share of community housing in our country, So Canada, through our successive governments, have really not invested sufficiently in community housing to enjoy what other OECD countries have, which is what Ray had mentioned just a moment ago. So all level of governments, in our opinion, should be doing everything possible to unlock the languishing economic productivity which exists in our country because of this lack of investment in community housing. Canadians in need of community housing are unable to contribute to their truest potential, which prevents them from living their best possible lives, and for Canada to achieve its truest economic productivity potential. Improvements to productivity improve overall quality of life, and therefore increasing the supply of community housing actually benefits everyone in our country. It's not often when countries or governments are actually provided with an opportunity to boost GDP up to $136 billion while not impacting inflation, but where investments directly address a current crisis impacting so many Canadians. The evidence is clear. The housing crisis is crippling Canada's economic productivity and our true potential. Now is the time to act, and to act boldly. So at Housing Partnership Canada, our members certainly see every day that these impacts have caused by decades of insufficient investment in community housing, a real degradation in our economy and in our economic productivity. And we also see how these investments could actually, if made, could consistently and sustainably improve our country's economic productivity. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce Matthew Stewart, and he is the Director of Financial Analysis over at Deloitte Canada.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to work on this piece. as we all know, productivity growth has been absolutely terrible in Canada over the last number of years, particularly in the last year and a half where we've actually seen declines in productivity growth. I think that's why it was such a pleasure to work on this piece, which was one of the first quantitative pieces that was able to link productivity growth to community housing. And a little bit on the methodology. What we were able to do is to link over 60 years of data in Canada's productivity growth and across every province to productivity growth and investments made in community housing. And what we found is that by improving Canada's investments in community housing up to the average of the OECD, which is about 1.5 percentage points of total housing stock, we would improve our productivity growth from 5.7% to 9.3%, which is $136 billion by 2030 in Canada's GDP. And it's not surprising that we would find these results. When you look at the literature and the evidence over why this investment in community housing boosts productivity, there are a number of clear reasons for that. One is it reduces labor market friction. Access to community housing improves people's abilities to take jobs where they're most productive in Canada's large cities. A lack of community housing also impacts the mental health of Canadians and makes it more difficult for them to invest in their own human capital. And it also, long commute times also boosts their ability to invest in their own human capital and improve their own productivity. And finally, high rents, again, limit their ability to fund investments in their education and, again, impacts productivity. And finally, one factor that we did see as well is the lack of community housing in Canada today has encouraged employers to invest in their own housing to bring people into these communities. And we found that, again, limits people's access to switch to jobs that may be more productive. So with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret Pfoh, who's the president of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and the CEO of the Aboriginal Housing Management Association. Margaret.
Thank you for that, Naeet. Hello, everyone. As a housing provider who's been in this sector for nearly 30 years, it is abundantly clear that we know that community housing saves lives. We know that if we provide stable and secure homes, that people who are most vulnerable to this affordable housing crisis need to find that sense of safety. We know that housing is a human right, and that it is also a key part of reconciliation. And indeed, as you heard from Deloitte, a key part of economic reconciliation. Now, we also know that having more community housing benefits all people in Canada by improving economic productivity. This report makes 5 key recommendations to government so that we can all realize the benefits. 1, increase investment in community housing to boost supply and kickstart productivity. 2, commit to stable, predictable funding and financing for community housing over a long horizon. 3, provide dedicated funding for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing across Canada. 4, coordinate with provincial governments, municipalities, and builders to make our housing faster and less expensive to build community housing. 5, support Canadian innovation that builds housing more equitably, quickly, sustainably, and affordably. Human rights include the right to housing, because housing is the foundation of everything. And without it, the very fabric of our society starts to disintegrate. This report and its analysis from Deloitte Canada shows that without affordable housing and safe places for our people to rest, our overall economy suffers. Now, I would like to invite Ray Sullivan back to the podium.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So as we've laid out, we have an opportunity to improve productivity by up to 9%, to increase GDP up to $136 billion, and address the shortage of affordable housing all at the same time in a way that does not add to inflation and in a way that increases quality of life for everyone in Canada. And I would add that the report from Deloitte also provides the same analysis at each provincial level, and the same relationship holds up. So we have time to take some questions. Do we have any questions online first?
We'll now take question on Zoom. If you have a question, please use raise hand function. don't have questions.
All right. I want to break down a little bit the important statement that we made, that the gains to the economy will outweigh the costs within 2 years of hitting this target. Moving from 5.5% of the total housing stock as community housing to the OECD average of 7% means adding about 370,000 new units, new affordable homes. The total cost upfront for government is about $120 billion over that 10-year period. And most of that, in fact, is loans that are repaid to government based on existing programs that are available. So a one-time investment of $120 billion over 10 years adds $67 to $136 billion to the economy each year after we reach that target. This is an important investment and hard to ignore. Spending on increasing the supply of community housing is not a cost. It's an investment that has positive returns for everyone in Canada. Does anyone have any other comments they'd like to add?
Sure. I think one of the key strengths in this data analysis is the recognition that Indigenous peoples across Canada, our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, have been long marginalized from taking their rightful seats at the economic tables of Canada. What this study does is demonstrate the capacity for Canada and all levels of government to demonstrate true reconciliation by inviting our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders and the organizations like AMA that support them to the economic tables of Canada to help everybody reap the benefits that we've demonstrated here. So, exit none. Anybody else?
Kevin, Matthew? We saw just last week the government released their fall economic statement, and it had some important commitments toward community housing. $1.3 billion specifically for community housing in terms of grants and contributions. And that was important, and I want to recognize and pay respect to that. At the same time, just a few weeks ago, the Federal Housing Advocate released a report saying that the shortage of homes affordable to low and modest income people is actually 4.4 million homes. This is the kind of scaling up of the community housing sector that we want to see and that we need to see these sorts of benefits. CHRA has long called for doubling the community housing stock. This report and analysis from Deloitte is actually much more conservative than that and is only an increase of 1.5% in terms of the overall housing stock. Imagine the gains that we would see both to the human cost and to the economic cost of the lack of affordable housing if we were to actually double the community housing stock. So we thank you to everyone who has joined us. Copies of the report and the analysis from Deloitte Canada are available on the CHRA website after 1 o'clock today, and we are available for follow-up questions and interviews with the contact listed on the press release. Thank you very much.